Well, I'm Hanzo Campo. Believe it or not, I'm not a student here at Cal. But I was a student. I was an alum, class of 2022, and now I work here. Been here for a year now, and I'm excited to just introduce our professor that's here to lecture today. But before I do that, I just want to thank everyone that's here, especially the donors that made this event happen. But to introduce our professor, so Emily J. Ozer is a professor of community health sciences at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health. Professor Ozer teaches graduate courses in behavioral science theory, mental health, community interventions, and program evaluation. Her research interests include school-based health promotion and prevention programs, post-traumatic stress disorder, and community-based participatory research. She is particularly interested in how the school and classroom context in which prevention programs are implemented affect outcomes. Her current research involves a multi-method study of the impact of an empowerment-oriented participatory research intervention on adolescents attending San Francisco public schools. Please welcome Professor Ozer.
Thank you very much. And can you see this screen okay in the back? Great. Okay, so before we get started, we begin with our land acknowledgement and aligned with our values of understanding our history and making visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. So gratitude for the land and how it was stewarded. And with that, I'm gonna share with you about my work and some approaches to strengthening youth connection to school as well as youth well-being. And first I'm gonna start with a little bit of who I am, where I'm coming from in doing this research in terms of disciplinary background and lived experience. I wanna share with you some key framings from the fields of public health, adolescent development, and community engaged research. I'm gonna talk a little bit about some partnered research here in the San Francisco Bay Area, but also that extends throughout the state. And then close with talking a little bit about youth development opportunities at Cal, because our undergrads are young adults as well. So I'm really hoping that you can take from this some ways of thinking about adolescent development and human development in generally, try them on for size. Also thinking about how we do research in some innovative ways with young people, as well as with their families and communities. And if you have questions at any time, feel free to stop and raise your hand. So I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. I trained here at UC Berkeley in the School of Psychology, but with a real focus on a subfield called community psychology. And that's really an area where we're really thinking about how do we work on the front end to promote mental health, and how do we collaborate with schools and communities and families to promote mental health in the first place? Because we know that unfortunately there are never going to be enough psychologists or therapists for sort of thinking about disorders down the road. So how do we really think about kind of baking in some of the conditions to promote mental health in the first place? And my appointment here, I've been a faculty member here for more than 20 years in the School of Public Health, so I'll also be bringing in some concepts and frameworks from public health. And right now, I am the director of the Institute of Human Development at UC Berkeley, and I've also, throughout my career, really taken a developmental perspective. So I'll be kind of bringing in these sort of interdisciplinary ways of thinking about development. So what does this mean in terms of how I approach the challenge of promoting well-being and also connection to school? So one thing is that we really think about what are the kinds of competencies that we really want to develop early in life? What are the resources? And a particular area from developmental psychology and developmental science is thinking about attachment. And attachment, initially to parents or to other family members, but also to school, and other important individuals. And that attachment provides a solid base. Those relationships and relational trust provide a solid space for coping with stressors, throughout the lifespan, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But that sort of balance or dance between connection and independence that we see in a young child, we also see in young people, college students, as well as others. Throughout the lifespan, there's that dance where we need both of those things, and it can look different. My background in community psychology also really orients me towards thinking about how do we work with communities in ways that strengthen the resources and relationships that are there. So as a professor at Cal, for example, if I'm working with a school district or with a community-based organization, I want to think about what happens after I leave. What are the resources that are already there? And so that we work in ways we're really assessing the strengths that are there and helping to build those. So that's one value that I bring to this work. And then as we're focused on designing interventions, we think about the cultural and contextual fit. So it's not always one size fits all. We know there's a lot of important variation. And so these are some of the kind of values I bring to this work. So I was trained in doing psychotherapy as well as assessment, but my research is primarily on adolescent development in context, asking the questions about how do the settings, particularly school settings, shape adolescent behavior and health, and how do we improve settings for stronger long-term impact. So when we're working individual by individual, that's super important. But also we want to think about if we can strengthen those settings that support mental health, that's going to give us a longer impact. And I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the formative experiences for me that led to this career. So when I was a college student, I had the opportunity to live in northern India, northern and eastern India, and to learn about participatory research. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that is, but that's when the people who are affected by the issue or the challenge are the ones who are working on addressing it. So sometimes with quote unquote professional researchers, sometimes not, but it's really that kind of grassroots approach to health promotion. And then after that, I had the opportunity to live and work in Central America, also in other parts of the Bay Area. And in all of those experiences, I was not only learning about these kinds of collaborative and participatory approaches to health and mental health, but was also in Central America learning about human rights work and was working alongside of people who had experienced really massive trauma, including family members who had been disappeared in the context of civil war and repressive governments. So it really, for me, sparked questions about psychological resilience. Like how do we go on after that? How do we find, what are the kinds of strengths and resources? So that really sparked a lot of my research on trauma and resilience I'll share a little bit about. And then, fast forwarding decades of being here at Cal as a professor and doing research with communities around the Bay Area, that really paralleled my own becoming a parent and raising 2 children in the Bay Area and who are now young adults. Like many of you in the room are intergenerational groups coming back and really I think a lot developmentally about the importance of those relationships. How do we stay in relationships especially across differences? There's so much polarization that is happening, in our country, in our society. How do we really stay in relationships in our families and be able to talk across difference? So that's something that I really bring that developmental lens as much as I can to my own life. My children might say that's not great to always be. And actually, one thing I did want to point out, so that photo from India, so I was 20, and my neighbors loved to have me dress up in sari, and I noticed that the sari that I had chosen to buy was blue and gold and tie-dye. So I feel like that was very appropriate to Cal. I was already thinking ahead to fitting in here at Cal. So as I mentioned, my research approaches have focused on risk and protective factors for post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD and depression, always very interested in what are the factors that can be changed that are amenable to intervention. participatory research with, that engages young people as expert social scientists and peer educators and policy advocates. And as I mentioned, a lot of this has been in partnership with school districts and community-based organizations, because that's where young people are. So that's been a great way to really reach a wide range of youth and families. If I were just working in more clinical settings, or when young people were referred for therapy or treatment, then I really wouldn't be working with the whole population level. And so that's been a good fit for my goals, as I mentioned earlier. Schools are such a key setting for youth development, so it's been exciting to work there. And to really be thinking about what are more universal approaches to youth well-being? How do we think about mental health in all policies, not just in terms of like what's happening in a counseling office, but what's happening in terms of, say, school discipline or homework, or sort of, how are schools set up to create the conditions for young people to thrive? Okay, so one model I wanted to share with you from public health, but also from psychology, is called the social ecological model. And this probably, in a lot of ways, is kind of intuitive, but it's really saying that, when we look at the individual development of a young person, it's really happening in the context of these relationships, their friends and family, their community or their society. And we know that, I think in some ways that seems obvious, but when you think about it, a lot of the research that has often been done is really just focused on individuals. And it's a lot harder to do this research that looks at the interaction or the intersection between the individual, family, community. But so well-being is shaped by these multiple facets. They're in interaction. And health is not just the absence of disease. We also need to really think about health promotion as it relates to those settings. So oftentimes people hear that the nature versus nurture. We really, in our fields, really think about its nature and nurture, how we think about differences in nature, interact with variable experiences of nurture in those settings to shape human development. So that's just a key take home. So the meta questions that I think about in my work and at the institute that I lead is, how do we strengthen key environmental contexts to promote healthy human development? And when we ask those questions, it really takes us beyond Cal and beyond the university to be engaging with people who shape practice and policy for human development. Another frame I wanted to share with you, if you're not familiar with it, is to think about this focus on prevention and promotion. So you might hear people talk about more universal promotion. That's something like fluoride in the drinking water, something that everybody's getting. And so it's really the whole population. And then there might be other interventions that we engage in where, like, we really want to focus on specific individuals or a subgroup who we know is at increased risk of developing a disorder. So for example, if you're someone like me who has family history with folks who've been challenged with anxiety or depression, there might be some higher risk of developing the disorder. So you might think about, this isn't just something for everybody, but this might be targeted towards people who might have a higher risk in some way. And then we talk about indicated, where you're targeting high-risk individuals who already are showing some symptoms. So maybe as we think about depression, there might be depressed mood, but they're not showing some of the other symptoms. So again, just a broad frame of when we think about public health, and we think about going from just sort of beyond the individual to thinking about how we work more broadly for population mental health. Another key frame I want to share with you is when we think about, we use the term stress all the time, but what is stress, and how does understanding some of the theory and research behind stress, how can that be helpful to us? So perceived stress is something in the environment that makes demands on our internal resources or our ability to cope, right? There's some judgment that there's what's being asked for in the environment is more than what we can handle or we have resources to cope with. And also important is that there's something at stake here. Like if there's not something at stake, it doesn't feel stressful, right? But that there's something at stake, whether that's your safety or your well-being or your status or your identity, that's what makes it stressful. And so actually developed here at UC Berkeley many decades ago is this stress and coping model that it's transactional, and what it says is that might be important. I find that I use this in my own life actually all the time, and also as I think about working with young people, is that at first there's some sort of appraisal or assessment of the stressor, like what's out there, what's coming at me, and is this something that is actually a threat, or is this something that is like a challenge I'm excited about in some way, right? So there's some sort of external appraisal of the stressor. And then there's this secondary appraisal of like, well, what do I have to bring to bear? What are my coping resources here? And so I think that's something that's a sort of key theory coming from psychology that is important for thinking about mental health and well-being is those steps. Another thing I want to highlight is how important adolescence is as a critical transition when we think about well-being and mental health. So there's extremely rapid changes happening between 10 and 14, cognitively, biologically, psychosocially, and there's a lot that adolescents and young people are navigating in many different domains. We also know that this is the initial time when we have the first episodes of mental health disorders are happening in this time period. So it's a really key area to be thinking about prevention and promotion. Obviously, we want to be thinking also from much earlier in childhood in terms of what leads up to it. But this is a really key time for support. It's also a really key time in which the settings, whether those are school or community settings or teams or religious communities, whatever that is, are providing really important opportunities or can provide important opportunities for positive engagement with developmental needs of young people. So what are those developmental needs of young people? So there's been a lot of theory and research over the last few decades that talk about developmental needs for values, goals, and identity, because this is a very flexible window for developing values and heartfelt goals, a sense of meaning and purpose. I think we often think about, are our kids, or are we happy? And really what often is the most critical, are you meaningfully engaged? Do you have that sense of purpose? Because that's often what is going to lead to those feelings of self-satisfaction and self-worth, et cetera. Important needs around decision-making, emotion regulation, support from caring adults, respect and social status, and also safe opportunities for risk-taking and exploration, right? And if those safer opportunities aren't there, we're going to find them in other ways. So I think many of you are aware, and there's been a lot of press around the mental health challenges for this generation. There's widespread conversation about the kind of crisis that we're experiencing here. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic was a major challenge and threat in terms of that. But very high and very concerning statistics in terms of what's going on with this generation. So when we take that social ecological frame and we think about risks, there are some of the risk factors around academic pressures, global issues like climate change, social unrest, political unrest, social isolation and lack of belonging, discrimination and marginalization of various kinds, adverse experiences and trauma, and then there's been a lot of conversation and some research on the negative impacts of social media, which we can talk a little bit more about. But we also know that not all stress is bad. You need some level of stress for challenge and growth and learning. And so that's really where that transactional stress model that I showed you a few minutes ago is really key, because if it's conditions of challenge and you have the supports to meet those challenges, then stress can really be a positive towards growth, to really enable mastery. And so that can happen in a lot of different ways. And sometimes there can be helpful self-talk and support about really understanding what can be learned from the stress and how to engage with that more positively. But I think a big question for us in education, obviously as parents, but also in education, is how do we create the environments that enable that kind of active coping and stress engagement? So some of the protective factors include healthy peer relationships, supportive adult relationships, extracurricular and community activities, being able to have those emotion regulation skills, to understand and manage your emotions and cope better with difficult situations, and then openness to seeking help and support. So that's really sort of general background as we think about some of the key concepts as we think about well-being and mental health. And now I want to shift to sharing with you a little bit about the kind of research that I was exposed to actually first in India and Latin America, but then has been something I've been working on for several decades. And that's about participatory and collaborative research. So it's really research with rather than research on. And I'll be sharing a little bit more about that. So I'm not going to go into this whole thing, but I just want to sort of, when you think about engaged research and engaged scholarship, all of us many of us, faculty, regardless of what discipline or department we're in, we really want to publicize our research and we disseminate our research. But where the kind of what I'm going to be talking about is less about we're here in the university and we're doing our research and then we kind of translate it and push it out in terms of the findings, but approaches to doing research where we're working directly with some of the folks who are directly affected, whether that be an educational system or with young people in a community. We're working with them from the start and helping to have their expertise shape what our research questions are. So rather than sort of saying, I'm going to do my research on adolescent mental health, and I hope that it will be applied by school districts later, I'm working with the schools at the front end and saying, well, what are the questions you have about mental health or how to promote mental health or youth well-being or attendance in your schools, and how can we kind of work together to ask some questions that will be of use to you at the end. So it's a kind of co-construction, collaboration of research, and I'll be sharing a little bit more about it. So in one form, and in public health, we call this community-based participatory research. As I said, it's where those who are affected by the issue or challenge are co-researchers in the work itself. And it may not be that, and they're making decisions together. So for example, as I'll share with you, it may not be that, like on the Berkeley side, we might be doing data analysis, because that makes sense because we have students who are learning about data analysis. But when it comes to making decisions about what the research is about and interpreting the findings, that's something that we're doing together. And why I've been so excited and interested in this over the decades that when I first learned about this as a young person in India, when I learned about participatory research, it's because it not only has the capacity to help us really address super challenging problems with the expertise of those who are living them. That's really important, right? Potentially, because we're sitting here in the university and we have our ideas about what's going on with young people, but we're not living what they're living, right? So you can see the potential power of bringing all that theory and research of UC Berkeley together with the lived experience of young people and their communities. It also really kind of in some ways just very much reimagines and pushes the boundaries of who has expertise to create knowledge, who is seen as expert, whose evidence is valued. And so it's really kind of pushes the traditional scientific research approach on its head in different ways. So that it's exciting. And so the particular form of research that I've been working on for more than 2 decades in partnership with San Francisco Peer Resources and San Francisco Unified School District and others is called Youth-Led Participatory Action Research. So in this approach, young people are trained to be researchers. They're coming up with the questions, the issues they want to change in their schools and communities. Then they're getting trained, whether that's surveys or observations or sometimes art-based forms of data collection. They're getting trained in that with support from adults to improve their schools and communities. And so I don't know if you can see the slides very well in the back because of the way the lighting is, but you can see it sort of starts with this team building and strengthening the relationships in the student group. Then they select an issue. Then they learn about data collection. They have a research design, and then they report back. Sometimes to adults, often to adults. Sometimes they're peer educators who are taking action themselves. So I wanted to share with you a brief video. And there have been hundreds of these projects that we've worked with in San Francisco alone for the past couple of decades, but all across California and all across the state, across California, the nation, and even beyond, there are these cohorts of young people who are doing this work. This is just one example that because there was a documentary filmmaker from the school who wanted to who do a film, we have this documentary. Yes?
Something popped to me when you showed that last model there, and I thought it was really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. This is exciting. It aligns with the idea in software development known as agile math,
Okay.
agile approach. And I was curious whether anyone else was thinking along those lines too. Agile depends on people over process and about iteration, multiple iteration, fail fast. Use the knowledge gained from that, just turning the old hierarchical models upside down. And the result is that you can end up spending a lot less money and time in getting the result that you want with respect to a software.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. There has been some interesting overlap between how we think about human-centered design and participatory research. So I'm less familiar with this agile approach, but I think there are some interesting parallels in terms of human-centered design as well. But so happy to chat more about that. I'm going to push this video to start it. I don't know if it would make sense to dim these lights slightly or not.
They decide to focus their energy on how can we improve the
I'm gonna, let's see.
there. They weren't accomplishing those steps. They've decided to focus their energy on how can we improve the learning in the classroom.
Should I make it bigger?
So from there, we did a lot of research. We did surveys for staff and students. We conducted interviews on staff. We looked into the observations where we got a chance to sit in the classroom and observe a teacher and then let them know what they're doing well. That's how we created the best practices.
My students decided to create a best practices club modeled after the best practices club at a high school in Lexington, Massachusetts.
So with the observation process, first we do the pre-observation conference.
They wanted to know what I wanted them to look for. Then they kind of gave me some feedback of what they may want to look for also.
We taught them how to kind of approach the person and then how to present themselves as well.
Basically, we meet with them, ask them questions about what's going on with the class, what they're going to do that day.
I told them what they were going to come in and see.
If a teacher asks us for a certain thing they want us to observe, then we have to do that. And if there's anything else, then it's just like kind of like a side note.
They asked me specifically, they're like, what do you want me to look for? And they even gave me some cues because I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted them to look for.
Are there any issues of equity you'd like us to consider as look for best practices?
I have one freshman student who can tend to check out and not participate. So if you guys could look to see if I motivate her.
They asked really good questions. They're very professional. And I really felt like I wasn't talking to a student. I was talking to almost like a peer.
From there, they get to sit in the classroom and do the observation.
We observed his honors class.
They did the observation, and that was for a whole period.
That's pretty fun, like observing the teachers. Like you get to see what their lesson is.
I was kind of more engaged on the lesson, but then I still kept in mind what he wanted us to.
Okay, so that was just happy to share the whole video with you if it's of interest, but just for time, we're going to do that one. And I don't know where the lights are here, but I'll keep going. Oops. And now, Oh, I got to get out of here to keep going. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if there's like a halfway in between. Is there something? Can you see? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I feel like it's been a little hard for you guys to see the slides. So is that work better? Yeah. Great. Okay. So that's one example of a project that was at John O'Connell High School in San Francisco some years ago. And but so you can kind of get like come to life a little bit. Is that the students had wanted the graduation rate was low and the absenteeism rate was high, and so the students wanted to figure out like what are the best practices that really engage students in culturally responsive teaching. So that was what shaped their research question, and then they ended up taking the data that they found and reporting it back. They did a professional development for their teachers at the school. And so it was a very powerful model, one example, but students have worked on hundreds of different topics and hundreds of different projects and many, many different topics. And so one thing I like to sort of to give a little clarity about is, so what I'm focusing on here is youth-led participatory action research, and that's where there is this systematic research evidence that young people are generating. There are other forms of youth voice or other ways of learning about youth experience and research in more traditional research where we're doing adult-led research. Often we're interviewing young people or we're observing young people or we're surveying young people. But a really key difference is that the young people, and that's all perfectly like important and valid research, but the young people are not, they're not making decisions, they're not giving input in terms of like the design or the results or the findings. So there's no kind of power sharing there, whereas this participatory research approach has this very specific focus on sharing power and making decisions together. And then kind of related to the agile point, perhaps you can tell me, I raised earlier, there are other kind of intermediate forms like human-centered design where, for example, the city wants to design a park or they want to redo the transportation system, and they will engage young people as consultants in hearing what their views are, doing focus groups with young people, or maybe even doing some inquiry-based kinds of projects. But the adults are coming up with the question and the issue, and in this form, the young people are coming up with it. So there are many different forms, and it's not one size fits all. But so it's a lot of work to do this. Why would you do it? And I've already alluded to this earlier. But here in my work over the past 20 years and my colleagues, here are some of the reasons why you would have this research with approach, this participatory research approach. One is, what does it do for the young people who participate? In what ways do they benefit, gain a sense of purpose, contributions? Going back to those developmental needs we talked about earlier, how is this an approach that really engages young people in having that sense of purpose, bringing their expertise to make change in their schools and communities? As I alluded to earlier, they're also bringing their insider expertise that can make our research potentially better and more valid because it's informed by their lived experience, but can also make it more effective and impactful if we're trying to design interventions or programs for young people to have them not just as people giving sort of feedback from focus groups, but also helping us really like hone in on the right questions and methods. And then, this partnership rationale, there definitely is, this is sort of an image of an ivory tower, but there are definitely communities who will strongly say that they don't want to be studied by the university. They want to be the agents kind of in charge of like what research is done, because there have been negative experiences and harm that's been done sometimes by research, right? And so there's also kind of an important sort of ethical basis. Not to say that any research that isn't done in partnership isn't okay, that's not the case, but there's really some very important situations and communities that have said, you know what, like we want to be in charge of the research that gets done in our communities. And some very strong examples also from American Indian and Native communities that might have their own like ethics board, and they want to decide what research gets done. for example. So in our lab, we've not only, one of the questions we've asked over the years is what are the benefits for young people who participate in this approach? And this is an example of a systematic review, this is a schematic of the types of youth outcomes and the types of environmental outcomes that have been studied in the literature, and that we have been analyzing the entire research literature to see what's the evidence for benefits of this approach. One example of a systematic review that was conducted by Amia Nash Chambers on our team really tracked what has been studied in the literature in terms of youth agency, sense of belonging, collaborative problem solving, curiosity, and identity. And so, oftentimes this research is very small and local. So there actually have not been a lot of large-scale studies of impact. We are currently applying for funding and doing collaborative research to try to do those larger scale impact studies. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the local YPAR partnerships, so Youth Participatory Action Research Partnerships. And this has been a long journey for me, starting with that spark from the work in India and Central America, building into a partnership with San Francisco Peer Resources, which is a nonprofit youth development organization in San Francisco, a series of two decades of research and more that has ranged from what's the impact of young people who participate using quasi-experimental designs. We randomize classes to engage in the YPAR versus regular peer education, for example. Then also really working to develop the expertise more broadly in the field to do this kind of work. And then the work we've been, some of the research we've been doing over the past 5 years has been looking at what happens with the evidence that young people generate. Does it have an impact in terms of what happens in the school district, for example? Does it change anything concretely? Does it change how adults think about the topics or issues as well? So, and at the same time, I've had children in the San Francisco Unified School District, so it's been an interesting situation of having multiple hats, because I've done research in schools that my children attended, and so it's had a lot of different forms of learning. So one of the products of this collaborative work is called the YPAR Hub, and if you're interested in it, there's a QR code here, or you can just go to yparhub.berkeley.edu. But after we did this research and people were hearing about it, we kept getting asks for technical assistance or support, and so we ended up with our partners creating a free online site with downloadable curricula so people around the country, around the world could do this. And we've been really gratified. It's been much used, thousands of users, or at least visitors. We haven't had the technical expertise to necessarily assess it as we might like, but looking in terms of what we see on Google. And then that led to an invitation about 7 years ago from the San Francisco Unified School District. And the head of research at the district said, we've been going to these conferences and we've been hearing about this YPAR work that you were doing in the schools, but it's not reaching the district office. What's happening is the students are doing these projects, they're presenting back, and the teachers are hearing about it, or the principals are hearing about it, but it's not being integrated into our data systems. And we're a district that really cares about using data in improving, and we know we need to improve. And one of the areas they really needed to improve was around attendance and engagement. And they had some big disparities related to that. And you can see here the focal groups, the student groups who were really having more chronic absenteeism. And that's 10% or more missed during the school year. So you're missing a lot of learning and a lot of socializing if you're missing that much school. And this is something that is not just a problem for San Francisco Unified, but it's been a problem for districts across the country, especially coming back from the pandemic. And so, they wanted to work on this, and they said, we also want to do it in a way that we're learning from the students themselves. We know that the YPAR projects that are happening in our classes are asking about engagement and belonging, and we want to figure out how we can move forward with this approach. And so we created a research practice partnership, and it's want to emphasize that this is very much a team effort, and it's not just the School of Public Health. It's not just me in the School of Public Health. It's people in education and social welfare, support from the Vice Chancellor Research Office on campus, and a lot of folks at the school district across different parts of the school district. And I think one of the reasons why this is so important is because we know that the reasons why students aren't in school are not just issues that have to do with what's happening in the school itself. They could be chronic health issues, they can be transportation issues, they can be housing issues. It really draws from the expertise of a lot of the Berkeley campus, and also not just the school district itself. So yeah, this is another way of representing all the different parts of campus and the parts of San Francisco Unified that have been involved in our partnership. And so where we are now with this is the real focus has been, where does this evidence generated by young people, all of their learning and insights and data, where does it enter into the routines and decision making of the school district? Because the way it sort of has typically happened is that the students would spend a semester or a year working on these projects, and at the end of the year, they would have a showcase or a report back, and everyone would say, "This is so awesome! They did such great projects. I can't believe students were able to do this. It's so amazing." But then it didn't connect with any of the routines of continuous improvement for the district. It was more like a student project. And so our work for the past several years has been identifying kind of where in the routines and the use of data evidence for the district itself does this youth-led evidence kind of get presented and can potentially be taken up? And how would we know if it is being taken up? And so what I wanted to share with you, and then where we're going right now, and some current proposals that are now under review from different funders, is to say, we know, as I alluded to earlier, we know that if we want to be working on the causes of absenteeism, we need to be working much more broadly across with the mayor's office, with the Children, Youth, and Family Services. We need to be working with the community-based organizations that work with young people who are unstably housed. It needs to be much more of a collaborative effort rather than sort of siloed within the school district. Because by the time students are, actually, if you think about it, it's really hard to work with the students who aren't in school because they're not in school, right? So you really need to be kind of working with the whole ecosystem. So some of the specific ways that some of the YPAR projects have helped inform some of the work related to absenteeism have to do with feedback around curriculum, feedback around mental health. A lot of this was happening with physical environment, with issues of safety. So these are sort of some of the ways that that both what we've been doing is bringing together the findings from the students in the YPAR findings with administrative data that the district has, and that's often kind of quantitative data. So it's been and the YPAR data can be quantitative or qualitative. So that's been powerful. Here's just an example. This was just an exercise that was done over Zoom that gives you sort of an example of students. These are students giving feedback about where they felt less supported in their online learning experience. Yes?
I just have a question on this because I know in the video what you mentioned earlier is about now students are, absentee is the big thing, but part of it is engagement. Like they're probably bored or whatever, whatever reason it is. But I'm curious how the teachers are responding to that kind of feedback from students.
Yes.
Like I know you mentioned that then they go present at staff meetings and whatnot. So when the teachers are seeing this about themselves, is systematic change really happening? Or they're hearing it from 14, 15, 16-year-olds, but not receiving it?
That's such an important question. Thank you for asking that question. So a couple different ways of answering that. So in the Best Practices Club example, the video that you saw earlier, That's why students intentionally focused on the best practices. They felt like if they didn't focus, so that was a way of bringing faculty in, giving the kudos for what was working. So it was definitely the carrot approach, and it was less challenging in terms of, because obviously we know that teachers and students are very different power relationships. There were other projects where, for example, there was a project at the Magnet School in San Francisco where actually the principal really liked what the students were saying and said, oh yeah, let's not, why do students have tests all in one day? We should do this in different ways. That the teachers were not happy and was really unhappy with the principal with that. So power operates in a lot of different complex ways. And I think the question about how do you create the conditions for this to be heard and create a learning environment across those power differentials is something I would love to talk with you more about. That's something we study very in depth, but it's incredibly important. And yeah, and so I think thinking about how that's done well, and a key piece of this is the adult facilitator, because that adult facilitator is with the students, but they're also a staff member, and so they broker a lot of that strategically and sort of think about how do we do this, how do we create conditions where, because I've also been in rooms where young people have presented and they left the room and they felt like nobody heard us, people were on their phones, they felt really disrespected, or they got totally shut down because of, so a big part of that first part of the approach is to really strategically analyze, if we're gonna work on this issue, who will be in support of it, who will be against it, how can we be careful and thoughtful about how we do this? So they really do need a lot of strategic support for doing it. That's a great question. And there's also a really good example, there's a really good example, there's the Peer Leaders Uniting Students, which is a California-wide called PLUS. And they have a great example that we've written about where the students presented their findings to the teachers that said that students didn't feel like there was a teacher who really cared about them at the school. It was a very low number. And the teachers said, well, that's not true. We care about students. But the Y part skillfully created a space to say, you feel that way, but the students aren't feeling that way. This is their experience. How can we create an environment where we have people with very different positions of power, and they have different narratives, and how can we bring evidence together and really and then the teachers worked on it, and when they did the survey again, it had gone really far up. So it was an example, and that's one of the things why I really love this work, because I feel like being trained in these kinds of approaches also creates opportunities for students and adults to be together across difference and to be able to hold these different narratives and look at evidence and sort of say, it's not just one truth. How do we kind of bring this together? And how do we work together to kind of have a shared understanding and improvement? So thank you for that. I was just going to share briefly, this is a YPAR dashboard that Brian Villa, who's now a postdoc in my lab, but he did as a graduate student. Because one of the things we discovered is, as I alluded to earlier, students are doing these projects, but where does the learning go? Where's the institutional memory? And so Brian has developed this dashboard using GIS mapping approaches, and now he's beta testing it. We're looking for funding to support that. But he is essentially where any teacher or district administrator or principal in San Francisco could say, hey, I'm working on this issue. What are the findings for English language learners, or what are the findings around absenteeism? So over time, we can have this kind of institutional memory, and that essentially SF Unified can be more of a learning organization because they can also learn from the expertise of their own students. So with that, I think just time-wise, I'm going to move through these pretty quickly so we have more time for Q&A, but I appreciate the questions that have been coming in. I want to talk a little bit about the broader context for doing this work, particularly in California, is that now in California there was legislation that students need to be part of budgeting at the county level. It used to be that parents were required to be part of the budgeting for counties at educational county offices of education, but now it's students. So there's a student voice mandate in district. There's now a state level California Youth Empowerment Commission that's supposed to advise the governor and the legislature on issues that are important for youth for legislation. And with all of these, they could either be sort of a like check the box, kind of not like it happens but not really, versus something that could be a lot more authentic. And so we're working on how is it that these groups can actually, that's where the dashboard comes in, can really see the findings of students across the state. So you're not just having a small handful of students who have to represent the whole state, but they can also draw on the YPAR findings. And then just briefly to say that in my classes at Cal, I try to bring this work to our work at Cal as well, right? And so we have used participatory research classes that I teach here to have students map out what are the factors that affect their mental health here. And with a sophomore seminar, which I probably won't be teaching for a while, but we had students really identify, you know, the advising system in letters and science, that was something that was contributing to stress. It wasn't their social, it wasn't so much about like mental health services, but they saw the ways that the education was set up was also causing stress for them, kind of going back to the stress model we were talking earlier, and was so gratified that the executive dean and another dean of letters and science came into my sophomore seminar here at Cal and listened to the students, listened to the data that they had gathered, and took that in as they tried to adapt that system. So I think there are all really exciting ways to think about what do we do, what are the work, how do we work out in the community, but then how do we bring some of these developmental principles to what we do here at Cal. And so a few more QR codes if you're interested and you want to hear more about this work. One is Innovations for Youth, which is a center that I co-founded with other faculty and has really been holding a lot of this community partnered work. And then, and we have many partnerships with across a range of different issues across the state and beyond. We also have something called the Youth Equity Discovery Initiative, which is one of the discovery experiences on campus, and that's a way that undergrads can be embedded within some of these partnered research opportunities. So if you are an undergrad and you're interested, feel free to if you go to the Innovations for Youth website, you'll see that, and then here's a QR code for that. Because we really see this scaffolded leadership of the undergrads being supported by the graduate students and the faculty in this partnered research. And then as I mentioned earlier, Institute of Human Development, I'm now directing this institute. And our mission is on innovative scholarship and training across disciplines and the systems that shape human development to really generate actionable solutions. It's all about thriving. And we know with humility that there's a lot of great knowledge and a lot of great scholarship here at Cal, but it doesn't have an impact in the world unless we're really in relationship and in authentic collaboration. And so this is where, and we have been around for, I was going to say, almost 100 years. So we're coming up to the centennial of the Institute of Human Development, and really welcome both students to attend our colloquia, our talks, our resources, but for parents or other alums, happy to have you engage and join our listserv or potentially come to events, and also excited to think about input about what does an Institute of Human Development at Berkeley look like for the next 100 years, especially given some of the challenges that we're confronting right now. And just, in the broader context, in terms of speaking about some of the challenges, obviously, happy to talk more after, but, severe challenges right now, especially in terms of federal funding for adolescent health research, longitudinal research, key data sets that we use to understand how young people are doing. You're probably aware of that. Here are some of the issues we're taking up at the Institute of Human Development. Love to get input from you all about the kinds of issues that you think are of critical importance. Also happy to share this slide deck. I know I've given you tons of information in a relatively short period of time. And with that, thank you so much and happy to engage. So maybe we can turn up the lights. I'm happy to stay after too if there are questions, because I know we only have a few minutes for Q&A.
How much say-so do the students get about which topics they're going to research? Do you guide them toward that? I could see a student coming up with a question to research that's just not relevant or practical or feasible or whatever.
So I understand your question as being how much say-so do the students have? What if they come up with a topic that doesn't make sense or that doesn't feel like it's as relevant? So there's a structured process for these YPAR groups where students come up with a lot of different ideas, and then they really weigh the strengths and the pluses and minuses of these different ideas. Like, can we actually learn something that would be actionable within the space of time that we have? And they pitch to each other. One of the way we do it in the class, or the teachers do it in the classroom, is there might be like 4 different ideas on different sides of the room. And the student who had that idea will kind of pitch to the rest of the group. Here's why this is an important issue. Here's why I think we should work on it. And then they'll say, like, okay, who wants to move to that corner? So they sort of engage in this kind of debate and dialogue, which is really important because there aren't that many environments now where you get to kind of engage in that kind of. So good point. It's not like every idea that any of us comes up with, whether we're younger or we have PhD after our name, is always good. But it's that kind of process. Thanks for that question. Yes, yeah. Do you want to say more about your question? Or no?
No, I was just curious because I teach down in San Diego.
Oh, cool.
So one thing that's popping up are community schools that provide like food, clothing, like necessities that maybe would get kids to come to school in our struggling areas. So I was curious if that's something that's becoming statewide or just.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. So, and maybe others in the room have experience with from what I'm sitting, one of the exciting things, we wrote a proposal recently with UCLA, and there's a center down there that provides technical assistance for the community schools network. And there, a lot of the community schools are very interested in this YPAR approach. And so one of the things, we actually have started a YPAR network nationally that has about 300 plus whether scholars, practitioners, et cetera. Anyone is welcome to join. We actually have a meeting on Monday. But yes, and so I think the community schools piece is also relevant to the absenteeism and engagement part, but also there's interest in participatory research in those networks. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I actually work in LAUSD, and we have a lot of community schools, and this is definitely something that I think we'd be interested in bringing. We're doing more project-based learning, but not this piece, which is exciting that it's student created and it's grounded in what students want. I'm curious, in San Francisco, has the school board adopted any of the students' input into their policy, especially around absenteeism?
Yes, let's talk. Thank you. And also, I'm glad you asked that question because in San Francisco Unified, there is a separate student advisory council. And a lot of districts have that, where there's a kind of youth board that isn't a YPAR class, but it's young people who are advising the superintendent or the Board of Education. And that student advisory council just asked us for support because they would like to do YPAR to guide their recommendations to the board. But it takes capacity to do this work well. And it takes support, and so that's one of the things we're doing it. And we've been meeting with them over the summer, but this district has had a lot of turnover, has a lot of challenges financially, and so sadly, a lot of the coaches who we've worked with for more than 20 years are having challenges in terms of their positions. And so one of the reasons we recently were interviewed on local news, and we've had some stories about our work. We're really wanting to lift up the importance of this work to also make sure that there's the capacity to do it well. So, yeah, we have studied some of that. I think one of the things we've learned is that, and we've heard from our partners and observed, is that often, the school board meetings are often like not the place where really the work gets done, and they don't create good conditions for really hearing people. So it's kind of like, how do you do that front end work? So it's kind of, and being integrated into data systems and part of, evaluation. So we're excited that San Francisco Unified is now bringing this YPAR dashboard into their data meetings with principals, so they can say, oh, you're interested in this? Oh, here's what students are saying about that. Because everyone's so busy and stressed. So how to do that well, yeah. But love to talk with you more. Time? Oh, thank you so much. So yeah, if you go on the QR code for the innovations, for Institute of Human Development, you can give there. And also happy to, my email was on the front. I'm eozer@berkeley.edu. So if you have questions, if you want to be put on our mailing list, if you'd like to contribute, and happy to and ideas are fine. And just happy to engage, and would love to, we're trying to also expand our advisory group for the Institute as well. Yeah. So I think with that, oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
What are those attributes that are seen, and how do they excel at a very good rate from age or environment?
So you're asking a question that is really about, in my field, it would be called the resilience field. And there's been some really important research over the past few decades. Some of it's life course research. And one of the key issues is having some kind, like going back to those developmental needs, is having that kind of support. Like whether even, for example, if you didn't have the support from your parents, but there was a coach or a mentor or someone else who was able to give that kind of support, or an older sibling, or having that kind of mentorship or support is one piece. But I have a much longer answer I could give to that, and I'm happy to share more. Yeah. Great. Well, I'm happy to stay after and answer more questions or connect in other ways. So thank you so much for being here.